She is handed a letter. The year is 1889, and the man who wrote it has just been found dead in a hunting lodge outside Vienna, lying beside his 17-year-old mistress. Her name was Stephanie of Belgium. His was Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son Empress Sisi ever managed to raise to adulthood. In that final letter, he found the space to mention 6 of his friends by name. For hers, he could find no room. This is the story of the wife erased from her own tragedy, and of the promise it took her 81 years to finally stop believing. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Crown Files. In the final decades of the 19th century, the Habsburg court in Vienna was, by nearly every account, the most dazzling in all of Europe. Crystal chandeliers, grand waltzes, and an empress so famously beautiful that strangers on the street would simply stop to watch her pass. History knows her as Sisi. She had only one son who lived to adulthood. His name was Rudolf, heir to an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Adriatic, and in the spring of 1881, a 15-year-old Belgian princess arrived at that glittering court. Having been told, she would later write, that it was her parents' express wish that she become the future Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. She accepted. She was never given much room to consider anything else. Her name was Stephanie, and for most of the century that followed, she would be remembered, when she was remembered at all, for a single night in a hunting lodge outside Vienna. A night she was not even present for. In 1937, an elderly woman living quietly in a castle in Hungary sat down to write her memoirs. 48 years had passed since that night. She gave the book a title, and the title alone tells you almost everything about the life underneath it. She called it I Was to Be Empress. Not I became, not I remained, was to be. When she had first tried to publish it 2 years earlier, the book was banned from distribution in Austria. It seems that even in her own memory of her own life, she was not permitted to speak first. This is what we do here every week. Not the varnished biographies of court painters and official portraits, but the private cost that power quietly extracts from the women standing closest to it, the wives, the daughters. The mistress's history prefers to leave out of focus. Stephanie's story is one of the clearest we have ever found of exactly how steep that private bill can be. Tonight, we are not telling you the story that has already been told 100 times over. The story of Crown Prince Rudolf and the 17-year-old mistress who died beside him at a hunting lodge called Mayerling. Films have told that story. A ballet still performs it, almost all of it from his side of the room. Tonight we are telling you about the woman left standing in the doorway of that story. The girl promised at 15 that she would rule an empire. The widow who at 24 found herself quietly and thoroughly blamed by the very court that had arranged her marriage in the first place. The daughter whose own father would years later, according to royal historians, have her physically escorted out of her own mother's funeral. Because here is what nobody tells you about being promised power. It is not the same thing as being given a voice. Not by a king, not by an emperor, not in the end, even by your own child decades on. Stephanie of Belgium would spend 81 years discovering exactly how wide that gap could grow, and exactly how much a woman could be made to survive without once being asked what she actually wanted. Tonight's story does not begin at Mayerling. It begins 11 years earlier, in a cold and formal palace in Brussels, where a little girl was already learning, long before any prince ever arrived to ask for her hand, that in her family, love was something rationed, never simply given. Chapter 1. The Answer by Morning. Every morning at the royal palace of Laeken, before the household was properly awake, a nursemaid filled a basin with cold water, and the children of the Duke and Duchess of Brabant were made to bathe in it. This was not a punishment. Their father believed it built character. There were 3 of them by 1868, Louise the eldest, Leopold the only son and heir, and Stephanie the youngest, not yet 4. Their parents had married as teenagers for reasons of state rather than affection, and had been growing apart for years. Their mother, Marie Henriette, was said to be happiest only on horseback, the one place, it seemed, where nobody required anything of her. Their father, already consumed by his ambitions in the Congo, rarely spent time with his daughters at all. The children were fitted into that distance wherever they could find room. Then, in January of 1869, the household's single certainty collapsed. Leopold, the heir, fell gravely ill and did not recover. He was 8 years old. Decades later, riding in a castle far from Belgium, Stephanie would remember that January with a clarity that had not dimmed with age. "The first event that was deeply engraved in my memory," she wrote, "was the death of this beloved brother, the poignant pain of my mother when he exhaled in her arms." She was 4.5 years old. She would carry the memory for the rest of her life. 2 years after that, not yet 7 herself, Stephanie fell dangerously ill with typhus as an epidemic moved through Brussels. For weeks, she drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware of the doctors murmuring at her bedside while her parents, still raw from one loss, waited to learn whether they would bury a second child within a decade. She survived. The doctor who saved her did it in the end, with the same cold water baths that had shaped her earliest mornings. The regimen that had once simply been discipline had this time kept her alive. A small, strange mercy from the one part of her childhood that had never once been gentle. What family life remained after that was conducted mostly at a distance and mostly in public formal portraits, state dinners, audiences in rooms too large for the number of people standing in them. A 4th daughter, Clémentine, was born in 1872, and the household simply absorbed her the way it absorbed everything. Quietly, correctly, without any particular tenderness on display. By the time she was 15, Stephanie had buried a brother, nearly died herself, and watched her parents settle into a marriage of formal courtesies rather than warmth. She did not yet know that all of it, the cold mornings, the careful distance, the practice of enduring whatever arrived without complaint, was preparing her for something far larger than a Belgian childhood. By then, King Leopold II was one of the richest men in Europe, a fortune built in large part on his private commercial ventures in the Congo. It did not buy him respect at the Habsburg court. Emperor Franz Joseph, weighing the match for his son, is said to have dismissed Stephanie's father privately as nothing more than a grocer. The daughter of a grocer, then, was about to become crown princess of an empire that considered her family barely fit to marry into it. And she would spend the rest of her life discovering exactly how thin that welcome really was. In March of 1880, her father sent for her. Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria, Hungary, had visited the court at Brussels, and the following day, King Leopold II told his daughter plainly what he expected of her. "The Crown Prince of Austria, Hungary is here to ask your hand in marriage," he said. "Your mother and I are very much in favor of this marriage. It is our desire that you should be the future Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. You can withdraw now, think over this plan, and give us your answer tomorrow." She was 15 years old. That night she spoke with her governess, a woman she called Tony, and with her mother, who told her with what seems to have been complete sincerity that becoming Austrian by marriage would be the greatest happiness of her life. Stephanie did not sleep. By morning, she had given the only answer that had ever really been available to her. Years afterward, she understood what that night had actually cost her. "I never guessed how heavy I should find the chains he was forging for me," she wrote. I had no inkling that I was already being betrayed. She would not learn until months later that Rudolf had not traveled to Brussels alone, that he had brought with him, unannounced to anyone in her family, a mistress the household would only ever refer to as Fraud F. By the time Stephanie found out, the engagement had already been announced in 3 countries. There was by then no dignified way to withdraw, only a wedding date moving steadily closer that she had agreed to before she understood what she was agreeing to. She had by then already been quietly assessed by the one woman whose opinion would matter most in Vienna, and found wanting. Empress Elizabeth, Sisi herself, reportedly considered the match beneath her son on the grounds that the Belgian monarchy had existed for barely 50 years, a mere adolescent among Europe's ruling houses. Nobody troubled to tell the 15-year-old bride any of this before she left home. She would have to discover it in Vienna, the way she discovered most things about her new family, on her own, and usually too late to do anything about it. On the 2nd of May 1881, a specially prepared train pulled out of Brussels carrying a 16-year-old girl toward a court she had never seen in a language she barely spoke. Inside the carriage, she lost her composure completely and began to cry. Her mother held her and then scolded her sharply for losing control in front of the attendants. Within minutes, exhausted by her own grief, Stephanie fell asleep before the train had even crossed out of Belgium. She was married 8 days later, on the 10th of May, in the Augustinerkirche, the parish church of the Habsburg court, a short walk from the Hofburg itself. For the ceremony, Belgian lacemakers had spent months on a veil unlike anything the Austrian court had seen handworked, impossibly fine, the kind of lace meant to outlast the woman who wore it by a century or more. It was made for a girl the whole of Belgium had been told would one day sit on an imperial throne. Whatever else it was proof. The one tangible proof a 16-year-old could hold in her own 2 hands that she had been chosen for something enormous. Crowds gathered along the route from the church. The bells of Vienna rang for her. For one single day, she was exactly what she had been promised she would become. Then came the evening. The newlyweds traveled by carriage to Luxembourg Palace for what should have been the beginning of everything. The ride was silent from start to finish. Not a single word passed between them, by her own account, in either direction. When they arrived, the rooms had not even been properly prepared to receive them, as though no one had quite believed the wedding would actually happen. It was an oversight that made the new crown princess feel, on the single most important night of her life, distinctly unwanted. She described it herself decades later in language she never softened for the reader. What a night, what torments, what horror, she wrote. I had not had the ghost of a notion what lay before me, but had been led to the altar as an ignorant child. My illusions, my youthful dreams were shattered. I thought I should die of my disillusionment. She did not die of it. She simply learned that night exactly how little anyone had prepared her for what an empire actually required of the girl who married into it. And yet, only days later, there was a moment that must have felt briefly like vindication. Traveling on to Hungary as part of the wedding celebrations, the new crown princess was met with a warmth she had never quite managed in Belgium. Hungarian colors were hung along her route. Somewhere in the crowd, a band found the Belgian national anthem and played it as she passed, and for once no one scolded her for what her face was doing in response. For an afternoon at least, it must have seemed as though the whole enormous gamble, the sleepless night, the silent carriage, the unprepared rooms, might still turn out to have been worth it. She was 16. She had a title most women in Europe would never come close to holding. It would take less than a year for her to learn exactly how little that title would protect her from what came next. Chapter 2. Standing in for the Empress in Vienna. It turned out being promised an empire mostly meant standing in for the woman who already had one. Empress Elizabeth had never much cared for the machinery of court life. The receptions, the audiences, the endless standing and receiving lines while strangers bowed at her. She had spent years finding reasons to be elsewhere, traveling, riding, disappearing for months at a stretch, sometimes to Corfu, sometimes to England. Always somewhere the etiquette books could not follow her. And now there was a 17-year-old daughter-in-law, recently arrived from Brussels, entirely unpracticed in any of it, onto whom a great many of those obligations could simply be handed. Stephanie asked her not to. She was still learning the language. She still did not fully understand the etiquette she was now expected to perform without error in front of an aristocracy already inclined to consider her family's throne a recent and slightly embarrassing invention. It made no difference. Within months, she was standing for hours at state dinners, in gowns stiff enough to stand up on their own, greeting ambassadors whose names she had been given only that morning, while the empress she was covering for was more often than not several hundred miles away. By her own account, the ceremonial calendar of the Habsburg court became almost overnight hers to carry. "I had no rest," she would write, "as I was obliged to appear at all ceremonies, now here, now there. Vienna's newspapers, for what it is worth, saw none of this." To the public, the young crown princess and her husband made a strikingly modern pair. She graceful and beautiful, in a way the aging court seemed to appreciate. He handsome and reputedly progressive, the kind of hair liberal Austria had been waiting for. Illustrated papers ran engravings of the two of them at the opera, at military reviews, at charity bazaars. Always standing the correct distance apart. Always smiling the correct amount. Photographs from those years show a couple who look, at a glance, entirely at ease with one another. It would be decades before anyone outside the family understood how little that photograph had actually captured. The christening, when it came, was its own quiet complication. Little Elizabeth was Emperor Franz Joseph's only grandchild through his son, the sole living proof, for the moment, that the succession had a future at all. The old emperor doted on her in a way he had rarely managed with his own children. It was, in its way, one more small reminder to Stephanie of exactly what her marriage had been built to produce, and exactly how far short of it she had so far come. There was for a while one thing that seemed to soften Rudolf toward her. In October of 1882, Stephanie discovered she was pregnant. Whatever else was missing between them, this finally gave the marriage something resembling warmth. Rudolf grew more attentive that winter than he had been since the wedding. Stephanie, for her part, was simply relieved to have found a way to be useful to him that did not involve a receiving line. The labor, when it came, lasted 26 hours. On the 2nd of September 1883, Stephanie gave birth to a daughter at Franzensberg Castle. She named her Elizabeth. After the grandmother, the child would grow up barely knowing. Outside the palace, Vienna celebrated in the way empires always celebrate a royal birth. Bells, official announcements, crowds gathering to cheer a baby they had never seen. Inside the room, Rudolf's disappointment was immediate and visible to everyone present. An heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was supposed to be a son. Stephanie, exhausted and still bleeding, broke down in tears in front of the attendants. Grieving in that moment, not the daughter she had just delivered, but the version of herself who had still believed she might get this one thing right. Somewhere in a cedar-lined trunk that same year, packed away with the rest of what remained of her wedding trousseau, sat the hand-worked lace she had once worn down the aisle of the Augustenerkirche. The piece the whole of Belgium had been so proud of. Nobody in Vienna had any occasion to bring it out again. It was by then simply cloth in a box in a room she rarely visited, proof of a promise that had already stopped doing anything for her except take up space. The marriage did not end there. It simply began, very quietly, to run on two separate tracks. In public, Stephanie continued to perform the ceremonial role Sisi had never wanted, and did it, by most contemporary accounts, competently. Better, in fact, than the Empress herself had ever managed to fake interest in doing. She learned to smile through introductions in 3 languages. She learned which ambassadors expected to be seated where. Little Elizabeth, meanwhile, became the one part of the day that required nothing performed at all. A small, ordinary comfort her mother had not been promised and had not expected. In the evenings, away from the ambassadors and the seating charts, Stephanie would sit with the child herself rather than hand her off to a nurse. Something the older ladies of the court apparently found faintly odd in a crown princess. She did not care. It was, for an hour or two most nights, the only part of her new life that had not been assigned to her by somebody else. In private, Rudolf began spending more time away from Vienna hunting expeditions that stretched longer than hunting required, political commitments that kept him in Budapest or Prague, or simply anywhere his wife was not. He had also begun, quietly and without his father's knowledge, funneling essays to sympathetic journalists, liberal, needling, occasionally scandalous pieces criticizing the very conservative policies the emperor stood for, published under other men's names so that no one could trace the arguments back to the heir to the throne. It was, Stephanie would come to understand only much later, an early symptom of something larger than restlessness. A man who felt so unheard within his own family that he had started arguing with his father in newspapers. His father would never think to suspect him of writing. At the time, she only knew that he was gone more than he was present, and that when he was present, he often seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Present in the room, absent from the conversation. Stephanie noticed. She would later insist in her memoir that she had not fully understood what she was noticing, that the shape of her husband's absences did not yet have a name she was willing to say out loud. That too would not last. Chapter 3a. What the court already knew. The absences Stephanie could not yet name had, by 1886, acquired a name after all, though not one anyone at court said out loud. By then, something had changed in Stephanie's own body that no ceremony, no gown, no receiving line could paper over. She fell seriously ill that year, feverish, in pain, treated for weeks by court physicians who spoke to her husband more candidly than they ever spoke to her. When she recovered, she understood, without ever quite being told outright, that there would be no more children. Historians who have since traced the medical record believe the cause was a venereal infection passed to her by her own husband, one that had quietly destroyed what her body needed to carry another pregnancy. Rudolf, for his part, did not improve either. Whatever illness he had brought into the marriage seemed, if anything, to be advancing faster in him than in her. He had begun treating it, and the depression that came with it, with large and increasing doses of morphine, washed down more nights than not with whatever was already open on the table. Nobody at court used the word syphilis. Nobody needed to. Wives in Stephanie's position were expected to understand the arithmetic without having it explained, and to say nothing about it to anyone, ever, for as long as they lived. None of it slowed him down in the ways that mattered to her. The affairs continued, more of them now, and less discreetly than before. actresses and society wives and women, whose names occasionally reached Stephanie through servants who thought she ought to know. His secret political essays kept appearing too, sharper and angrier, with each year that his father continued to treat him as an heir to be managed, rather than a mind to be consulted. He had begun, some of those close to him later said, to speak of feeling trapped, a future emperor with no present authority, married to a woman he had never wanted, waiting for a throne that would only arrive once his own father had finished dying. Which Franz Joseph, at 58 and in perfect health, showed no sign of doing any time soon. Stephanie noticed all of it, the way a person notices weather changing long before they admit out loud that a storm is coming. In October of 1888, she returned from a trip to Greece and saw him again for the first time in weeks. What she found frightened her more than anything that had come before it. "I was horrified as soon as I set eyes on the crown prince," she wrote. "His decay was so greatly advanced as to have become conspicuous. He was frightfully changed. His skin was flaccid. His eyes were restless. His expression had completely changed. It seemed as if his lineaments had lost the inner substance, which can only come from strength of will, as if a process of internal dissolution were going on. I was profoundly sorry for him and wondered how the devastation would end." She did something after that very few wives in her position would have dared. She went on her own to Emperor Franz Joseph, not to complain about her marriage, but to warn him that his son was disintegrating in front of everyone at court, and that someone with real authority needed to intervene before it was too late. The emperor listened. Then he told her, in effect, that she was imagining things. Rudolf was fine. There was nothing to be done because there was nothing wrong. She had been the first to notice. She would not be the last, and still nothing changed. She returned to her own apartments that evening, by her own account, with a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being right about something and being believed by no one who could actually do anything with it. There was no one else to escalate to. She had gone to the one man in the empire with more authority than her husband, and he had sent her home with a distinct impression that the problem was her perception, not his son's unraveling. 3 weeks later at the Hofburg, a woman named Countess Marie Laurish, Sisi's own niece, and by then a fixture of Rudolf's circle, brought a 17-year-old baroness to meet him in his private rooms. Her name was Mary Vetsera. She was younger than the wife, whose place she was about to take in the story, and considerably more dazzled by the idea of the crown prince than by the man himself, whom she barely knew yet. Stephanie did not know her at all, not really, not as anything more than one more name among the women who drifted in and out of her husband's orbit that season. Within weeks, most of the court would know it too. Stephanie, characteristically, was among the last to be told anything directly. Informed, when she was informed at all, by the silences of people who clearly already knew and had decided it was not their place to say so. By January, whatever version of a marriage the two of them had managed to sustain for 7 years had worn down to almost nothing. They still appeared together in public when they had to. They still exchanged the correct words at the correct occasions. The same practiced ease the newspapers had been photographing since 1883. On the 26th, they attended a large soirée together. The following evening, a reception where, by all accounts, they behaved exactly as a crown prince and crown princess were supposed to behave. Rudolf told her he had a shooting trip planned at a hunting lodge he had bought a few years earlier in the woods southwest of Vienna, a place called Mayerling, but promised he would be back in time for a family dinner on the 29th. He did not come. Word arrived at the palace that he had caught a cold and would not be able to make the journey back that evening. It was, on the surface, the most ordinary excuse in the world. The kind husbands had been sending home for centuries. Stephanie relayed it to the rest of the family herself, in her own words, at her own table, and no one sitting there that night thought to question it. Why would they? A cold was nothing. A hunting trip that ran long was nothing. She had spent nearly 8 years learning to live inside sentences exactly like that one, and she saw no particular reason this one should be any different from all the others. It was the last thing she would ever tell them on his behalf. Chapter 4. A letter addressed to her. The morning of the 30th arrived gray and unremarkable, the way most mornings that turn out to matter arrive. Stephanie had her usual singing lesson scales, an area she had been working on for weeks, the piano running through the same passage twice, because she kept missing the same note. She was, by her own admission, uneasy that day in a way she could not explain, a feeling with no obvious cause, the kind she had learned over 8 years not to trust and not to ignore. The lesson did not finish. Her chief lady, in waiting, entered and drew her aside, speaking in the low, careful voice reserved for news that cannot be delivered any other way. Stephanie did not wait to hear the details. "He is dead," she said, before anyone had confirmed anything to her at all. She was summoned almost immediately to the Emperor and Empress. It was Sisi. Not Franz Joseph, not any minister, not any official messenger, who told her what had actually happened at the hunting lodge. That Rudolf had been found in the early hours of the morning, dead of a gunshot wound, with the body of a 17-year-old baroness beside him. Stephanie had questions. Nobody in that room had answers they were prepared to give a young widow on the worst morning of her life. They handed her a letter. It was addressed to her in his handwriting, and it had been written before he did what he did. Even before the letter, there was already a version of events being assembled downstairs in rooms Stephanie was not part of. Suicide was a mortal sin in the eyes of the church, and a crown prince who had died by his own hand could not, under normal circumstances, be buried among his Habsburg ancestors in the imperial crypt. Within hours, the court physician who had first examined the body was persuaded to describe Rudolf's state of mind at the moment of his death as one of mental derangement rather than deliberate suicide. A medical fiction generous enough to secure him a Catholic funeral, and vague enough that almost nobody was ever made to answer for the 17-year-old girl who had died in the same room. "Dear Stephanie," it read, "you are freed henceforward from the torment of my presence. Be happy in your own way. Be good to the poor little girl, who is the only thing I leave behind. Give my last greetings to all my acquaintances, especially to Bombels, Spindler, Lor Neuve Gisela, Leopold, etc., etc. I face death calmly. Death alone can save my good name. With warmest love, your affectionate Rudolf." Read once, it is a farewell. Read twice, it is something closer to an inventory. He named the child. He named Bombels, his own adjutant. He named Spindler, Lor Neuve Gisela, Leopold, a full roll call of the people he wanted remembered on his way out of the world. Each one specific, each one deliberately chosen. He did not anywhere in that letter say her name again, after the salutation. She was the person he was writing to. She was not, in any way that mattered, a person he was writing about. Even in the final document of his life, addressed to her and to no one else, he had somehow still found room to write around her. She was 24 years old. She would live another 56 years without him, longer, in the end, than she had ever lived with him, longer than her marriage, her mourning, and her memoir combined. And by her own account, she never fully closed the wound that letter opened that morning. Whatever else the next 5 decades would hold for her, they would all, in one way or another, begin from this exact room, on this exact morning, with a letter that had managed to say goodbye to nearly everyone except the woman holding it. True, death had relieved me from conjugal life, which was full of anxieties, cares, and sorrows, she wrote decades later. But at what cost? My own future and that of the country, for which I had endured so much unfailing patience, seemed to have been shattered. Nothing remained but a burning wound in my heart. Long did it go on burning, this wound like the bite of a venomous serpent. Nothing could close it. Nothing could heal it. The court, meanwhile, had already begun deciding what this tragedy meant and whose fault it had been. It settled, with a speed that must have felt obscene to a woman still absorbing the fact of her own widowhood, on a story in which the marriage itself, cold, childless, long since abandoned in every way that counted, had driven a promising heir to ruin. No one at court put it to her quite so bluntly. They did not need to. She could feel it in the way people's eyes moved past her at the funeral, in the careful, correct condolences that never quite mentioned what everyone in the room was actually thinking. The funeral itself was staged with the full suffocating weight of Habsburg ceremony. Black horses, muffled drums, an honor guard stretching the length of the ringstrays. Thousands of Viennese standing silent in the cold to watch the coffin pass. Stephanie walked behind it in unrelieved black. A widow before she had even finished being a wife, watched by an empire that had already quietly decided she was at best an unfortunate footnote to her husband's tragedy, and at worst part of the reason for it. Mary Vetsera was not mentioned in any of the official proceedings. Her name would not appear in a single public account of that week, erased from the story as thoroughly as the court could manage, so that the only woman left standing in it for public purposes was the wife. Her parents arrived from Belgium for the funeral, and for a few days at least, she was not entirely alone in it. Her young daughter, not yet 6, sat beside her through most of the formal mourning. Small and solemn in black, holding her mother's hand through masses she was too young to understand. The only person in that palace, it seemed to Stephanie, who wanted nothing explained and asked for nothing performed. In the evenings, when the official visitors had finally gone, it was Elizabeth who climbed into her mother's bed uninvited, and Stephanie who let her stay there, in a household where almost nothing else, that winter was being allowed to happen simply because it was needed. It would not last. Within weeks, she would ask for the one thing every grieving widow asks for, and discover that even that, even simply going home, was no longer hers to decide. Chapter 5. The chain she learned to forge. The answer came back within days, and it came from 2 directions at once. Emperor Franz Joseph told her that a crown princess did not simply leave Vienna in the middle of a national tragedy, that her presence, however painful, was required to project the appearance that the dynasty itself had not been shaken. Her own father, in a letter from Brussels, told her something similar, that she should endure it quietly for the sake of appearances, and that a public display of wanting to come home would only feed the gossip already circling her. 2 men who agreed on almost nothing else had arrived independently at the exact same instruction: stay and say nothing. Sisi, for her part, said even less. The Empress, who had once handed her own hated duties to a 17-year-old bride, now withdrew from that same daughter-in-law almost entirely, unable or unwilling to be in a room with the living reminder of her son's collapse. Where they had once shared a household, the 2 women now largely arranged their days to avoid each other. And when they did meet at official functions, neither could escape. Sisi's condolences arrived so formal, so brief, That palace staff began to notice and quietly comment on it among themselves. The two women who had once negotiated an entire ceremonial calendar between them barely spoke again for the rest of their lives. For more than a decade after that, this was simply the shape of Stephanie's life. A widow performing a role nobody had bothered to redefine for her, in a court that had already decided quietly and permanently what to think of her. And then, in the late 1890s, at a diplomatic gathering neither of them had particularly wanted to attend, she met a Hungarian count named Elmer Lovanaye. He held no throne, no famous title, no army behind him. He was, by most accounts, a quiet, unremarkable diplomat who happened to make her laugh at a function she had expected to endure rather than enjoy. What he offered her, for what seems to have been the first time in her adult life, was a marriage she was allowed to choose, rather than one assigned to her at 15 by a father negotiating a dynastic favor. She was 35 years old. Nobody was asking her to become an empress this time. Nobody was promising her anything at all, which, after the promises she had already survived, may have been part of the appeal. In March of 1900, she married him, and in doing so, forfeited, by the rules of her former family, every royal and imperial title she had spent 19 years earning the hard way. She kept the name Lovanaye for the rest of her life, in a small castle in western Hungary that would, decades later, sit on the wrong side of a border neither of them had chosen. Her own father was reportedly furious at the match. A count beneath her. Exactly the kind of unequal marriage the Habsburgs would never have tolerated for a woman who had once been their crown princess. Her daughter, not it, cut off contact with her almost entirely. Unwilling to forgive a mother who had apparently decided that love mattered more than whatever remained of the family's dignity. 2 years later, Queen Marie, Henriette, Stephanie's mother, died in Brussels. Stephanie traveled home for the funeral, grief momentarily overriding the arrangement with her father. She approached the coffin to say goodbye. According to royal historians, King Leopold Sikliu had her physically removed from the chapel before she could finish, his own daughter, at her own mother's funeral, escorted out like an uninvited guest. 7 years after that, Leopold III himself died, having spent much of his reign turning his personal claim on the Congo into one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. Stephanie and her surviving sister went to court to claim their share of it. They lost. The money their father had built his reputation and his cruelty on went elsewhere, and the daughter he had once presented to a foreign prince as the future Empress of Austria was left, in the end, with no inheritance from him at all. Only the title she had already given up, and the name she had married her way into instead. She had spent her whole life being told what a woman in her position was permitted to want. In 1900, for once, she had simply taken it anyway. It would cost her almost everything her birth had once promised her, and it would, in the end, teach her own daughter exactly the wrong lesson about what a mother was supposed to forgive. Because decades later, it was Elizabeth's turn to fall in love with the wrong kind of man. By then a grown woman with 4 children of her own, long and bitterly separated from the minor nobleman she had married back in 1902. Elizabeth began a relationship with a social democratic politician named Leopold Petznick. A man of no rank at all by the standard Stephanie had been raised inside. A man whose politics were, if anything, even less acceptable to what remained of the family than Lovanaye's lack of a crown had once been. Vienna nicknamed her the Red Archduchess. She lived with Petznick for years before either of them could legally marry, walked beside him at workers' rallies, and gave away most of what she had inherited to causes her grandfather, the emperor, would have found unthinkable. Stephanie, who had once forfeited an empire's worth of titles, rather than give up a man she loved against her family's wishes, did not extend her own daughter the same grace she had once demanded for herself. She disinherited her. One can hardly be surprised. Stephanie had written once, decades earlier, describing her own parents' loveless marriage, that the children of such a marriage were foredoomed to unhappiness. She wrote that sentence about a different generation entirely, about her own childhood, her own cold father, her own distant mother, the basin of cold water each morning, and the love that had always been rationed rather than given. She does not appear to have noticed, or at least never wrote down noticing, that she had just done to her own child precisely what she had spent a lifetime resenting her own father for doing to her. The woman who had been handed a chain at 15 had, somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, learned how to forge one herself, and handed it, in turn, to the one person who had once seemed like the only unconditional thing in her life. Epilogue. In April of 1945, the sound reached Arvidsjaur before the soldiers did. Stephanie was 80 years old, living quietly with Elamere in the small castle that had been their home for over 4 decades. Longer, by then, than Vienna or Brussels had ever been. She and Elam